Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the part of the world you belong to. Today we are here for a very special occasion. And today we have with us Professor Lakshmi Bandlamudi and Professor Debashish Banerji, Kanchan, Ghosh and Gazi Nishad for a very special occasion on Sri Aurobindo. So today, Professor Bandlamudi will speak on Sri Aurobindo's Savitri. Dr. Banerjee will speak on the messianicity of Sri Aurobindo's Savitri, and I will briefly introduce Savitri to the speakers, and also Gazi will recite a small poem translated by him in Bengali, written by Sri Aurobindo. And Kanchanda will recite a portion from Sri Aurobindo's Savitri. So today's webinar or today's session is devoted to Sri Aurobindo, and we all know that we are celebrating the 150th anniversary of Sri Aurobindo, and as part of that, I guess this is going to be a trailblazing initiative. And since I have been assigned with the task of introducing the speaker, let me introduce first Dr. Bandlamudi. Dr. Lakshmi Bandlamudi teaches at LaGuardia Community College, New York. Dr. Bandlamudi grew up in Chennai in South India, which was a great cultural center, and hence concert halls and theater were an integral part of her formative years. She has had a lifelong fascination with epic tales, instilled by her grandmother, who was a master storyteller, and this experimental knowledge eventually developed into scholarly inquiry that became a book, Dialogics of the Self, the Mahabharata and the Culture, the History of Understanding and Understanding of History, published by Anthem Press in 2010. The most significant and transformative moment in her academic life occurred when she encountered the works of Mikhail Bakhtin as a graduate student. And for more than 25 years, principles of dialogism have guided her scholarly work, be it intercultural or interdisciplinary, beyond in promoting an intrapsychic and interfaith dialogues. Dr. Lakshmi Bandlamudi enjoys travel and has trekked in the Himalayas, in Tibet, Nepal, and India. A spiritual journey to Mount Kailash was recorded in the book Movements with the Cosmic Dancer on Privilege to Kailash, Manosarovar, forwarded by H. Dalai Lama, and in praise of the book, Dr. Karan Singh, New Age Books, New Delhi. She has trekked the Inca Trail leading up to Machu Picchu in Peru. She enjoys classical music and has training in Carnatic music, South Indian classical music. We are, we are honored to have you here, ma'am. And now I will introduce Professor Debashish Banerji. Debashish Banerji is the Haridas Chaudhary Professor of Indian Philosophies and Cultures and Dosi Professor of Asian Art at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He is also the program chair of the East-West Psychology Department. Prior to PISS, he served as a professor of Indian Studies and Dean of Academics at the University of Philosophical Research, Los Angeles. He has taught as adjunct faculty at Pasadena City College, University of California, Los Angeles, and University of California, Irvine. His interests lie in postmodern, post-colonial, and cross-cultural approaches to Indian philosophy, psychology, and culture. Banerjee has curated close to 15 exhibitions of Indian and Japanese art. He has authored and edited around 10 books and art catalogs on major figures of the Bengal Renaissance, such as the poet Rabindranath Tagore, the artist Avanindranath Tagore, and the spiritual thinker Sri Aurobindo, critical post-humanity, yoga psychology, on a variety of creative and art-related projects. His most recent books are Integral Yoga Psychology, Metaphysics, and Transformation as Thought by Sri Aurobindo, published by Lotus Press in 2020, and Meditations on the Isha Upanishad, Tracing the Philosophical Vision of Sri Aurobindo. It's published by Sri Aurobindo Samiti and Mahabodhi Publishers in 2019. We are also privileged to welcome you, sir. So with this, should I, ma'am?
Sure,
I
sure.
would request to start
Yeah.
with your presentation and then
Thank you so very much for this kind invitation and introduction. And it's really an honor to meet all of you and exchange ideas and engage in a dialogue. And that's what, so let me, so what is it that I want to do here is take from this wonderful book called Art and Answerability, in which Bakhtin is really talking about, you know, the very nature of aesthetic vision and architectonics. You know, how do we, architectonics means how do we sort of gather, you know, disparate elements and pile them and compile them together, and then achieving a metamorphosis, you know, a consummation is the aesthetic vision, right? That is the sort of the essence of it. This Art and Answerability was one of his very early philosophical works. And this was, you know, one of the things that is that we should bear in mind with the Russian thinkers who were intellects during this rigid Stalin era is that they had to write in a suggestive language. They had to write in riddles. So it is very much a question. I mean, fundamentally, what Art and Answerability is all about is really challenging the Kantian transcendental aesthetics. And then he's moving towards transgredients, you know, multiplicities of consciousness. And if there is only one consciousness prevalent, that is not going to lead to aesthetics. Aesthetics demand the intersection of multiple consciousness. And I'll try to go back and forth and more devote more time for Q&A, because I think everybody here knows Sri Aurobindo's works quite well. And what I want to sort of point out is Sri Aurobindo really discovered a new genre of philosophical spiritual poetry, unparalleled. I think it remains unparalleled to this day. And no one has written a masterpiece like this in terms of, so it is, why do I call it he discovered a new genre? Because it is not a fixed template into which he just simply poured in his ideas, but rather the genre itself, emerges. And it's you have to find a new genre in order to be able to write something like this, right? So this is a very interesting kind of, and I think by Sri Aurobindo's work lends itself quite well to a kind of a Bakhtinian reading of it, not necessarily analysis. I refrain from using the word analysis because whether it is Bakhtin or particularly Sri Aurobindo, you have to enter that world. Don't try to make it into a cognitive activity of having your pre-established, analytical categories and impose upon that, because it is simply, whether it is even as a matter of understanding or as a matter of, you have to enter that world and whatever. So there has to be a certain receptivity for these ideas to kind of enter your system. So just I want to read a few, from his letters on Savitri, because that gives us a hint about the creative process. And I'll talk about, I just want to sort of bring to your attention about the fundamental dialogicality in the very nature of Sri Aurobindo's work. Sri Aurobindo says, Savitri was originally written many years ago before the mother came. So and because it came, and then it goes in installments, and there is you write certain cantos, and then you engage in a dialogue, and he writes about this in various letters, on Savitri, that he is engaging in a kind of dialogue with the work that is already, and then I'll connect it to what Bakhtin is talking about. And then there is revisions, and then there is, more importantly, I think one of the things that he points out, he says, it is an inner feeling that has to decide that. Unfortunately, the mind cannot arrange these things. One has to wait till the absolutely right thing comes in sort of a receptive self-opening and calling down condition, and that is a very, rather instructive about the very aesthetic processes. How does this so-called body, or the mind, which is limited, how does it needs to open up in order to suggest the infinite. You're not representing the infinite, but you're suggesting the infinite. And more importantly, how do we sort of weave in the language in order to be able to do that? So those are, very interesting kind, and it's always very developmental. So Sri Aurobindo says the Savitri is represented in poem as an incarnation of Divine Mother. So in order for that the Divine Mother Shakti to flow through, and what is that kind of receptivity that is needed in order to bring that, whether you talk to an artist, a dancer, which is what Debashish was talking about, that he read my chapter on dancing in the sky of consciousness. So what I tackled, or what I tried to address, I know her quite well. She's a very eminent, Bharatanatyam dancer. And so for them also, they talk about this, it is not just simply the sadhana, the words and the, mudras and all those sorts of things, which she is quite, capable of. But what is even more important is that the divine energy has to. So that is something that I want to concentrate on, because there are so many issues that we could talk about. So when I say transgredients, what exactly does it mean? Transgredients is the convergence, and still everything remains, nothing is just simply blended. He was so opposed to it, like Aurobindo, even Bakhtin had no patience for dialectics, because dialectics entails a certain merger of voices, and there is the uniqueness of each entity is not necessarily, maintained. But what he's calling for is, it's almost like I think about Sri Ardhanarishwara, right? They both merge in one body, but each one retains their form, half their form at least, right? So you're not just simply completely collapsing. And so he believed in these sort of very, on one hand, porous borders, but benevolent borders. But there is also kind of a closure. Closure means momentary closure in any kind of artwork. So how does he begin with this? Just let me turn on this. Sorry. So how does he begin with this work? So what is art and answerability all about? He very much at the very beginning, he states, art is not life. Life is not art. So let's make that very clear. Although the genesis of art is in life, art is very high flown. Art is, when you're in art, you're not in life. When you're in life, you're not in art. Okay, so you cannot completely merge that, because this is the humble prose of life is no match to the grand poetry of art in whatever form that we talk. So then what then is the connection between art and life? That is answerability. you're answering to art. Life can be very impoverished if art remains in the higher plane and life remains on the plains, right? But it is through that connection. So my work on Mahabharata is really about answerability between life and an ancient text, so-called ancient text. Because how are you trying to because these have deep-rooted philosophical concerns. That is the Mahakal, right? The great time. How does a great time connect with the historical time, right? And it always does. So that is one of the things for the Indian philosophy to sort of make its voice be heard. And why do I say that? Because whenever you go into any kind of a Western, world, much of it is operating on binaries. For them, it is a form or the function or the structure or the function, and the big time. In fact, very few talk about the great time or the Mahakal. Sort of for us, we already have those notions present and that's what actually even Sri Aurobindo is really talking about. So he elevates a short story in Vanaparva in Mahabharata about Savitri, and then elevates that to the ascent of consciousness and the descent of the divine. So it is both ascending and descending consciousness, and that's where you see the connection with Kashmir Saivism, Abhinav Gupta, and others who have written on Natya Shastra, commentary on Natya Shastra, right? So the fundamentally the almost much of this book is really about author-hero relationship. What is the nature of the relationship between you can read it, in many ways, because he wrote under such difficult time period, we don't know whether Bakhtin tried to redeem aesthetics through theology or theology through aesthetics. Remember, the church was banned in the communist era. So, which means you had to sort of say, oh, I'm only writing about aesthetics, so which means you had to. So it doesn't matter actually. I mean, he too was sent to jail because of his activity in the in the Russian Orthodox Church. Incidentally, the birthplace of Russian Orthodox Church is in Kiev, Ukraine. So I hope they have that in mind before ruining everything, over there. So what he's saying is that initially the author has incredible sort of authority to embody, right, the power to embody the hero. Because the hero is still voiceless and formless and shapeless. So the author has the command over it, right? But as the hero, the creation, is being envoiced, right? Is taking some sort of a form, then it has to be dialogic, because what you create is not an mechanical, the hero is not a mechanical mouthpiece for the author to sort of pour his or her ideas into it. So you cannot take that complete. So you can, when we look at it, that is the sattvic kind of, that you relinquish. I'll get to that in a minute. So the author-hero relationship emerges, and once the form has taken and the voice is there, become the hero gets envoiced, then we are talking about having a dialogue. The dialogue begins. So that's where when Sri Aurobindo is writing about the processes, sometimes it takes several months, right? It takes several months to do the revision because he's engaging in a dialogue with what he has already created, And then there is, because that will shift, right? It is not, see, Bakhtin talks a lot about expressive aesthetics, as if it is popping out of your head. That is not something that, Bakhtin is not. Finally, why does he challenge the transcendental aesthetics of Kant? And even, in different places, Sri Aurobindo also challenges that sort of Kantian paradigm or a Hegelian paradigm. So you see that very, very clearly. So why? Because we cannot transcend our solipsism. To think that because we're always positioned in some time and space, a cultural time and cultural space. In one of the, I hope I'm able to, Sri Aurobindo talks about how, in order to get to the Savitri, he wants to sort of understand how she connects to the world, to give a psychological profile. I mean, although I had it all here, because the issue is about connection. It is not something that is just simply an elevated goddess or, that Bakhtin is talking, even Sri Aurobindo is talking about, but what is her connection? Because if she is disconnected from the world, then art is on one plane and life is on another plane. There is no connection at all. You have to sort of connect it because it is the grounded reality. The ground is very, so that's where the difference between Shankaracharya or, and Sri Aurobindo or Kashmir Saivism sort of exists. So the author has no semantic authority on his creation. You cannot, because you can only engage in a dialogue with your creation, but you cannot determine, when you read Mahabharata, in fact, that's one of the greatest polyphonic texts that you can think of, because Vyasa himself is not a very visible, although it is about his children and grandchildren and quarreling and so on, but each one is an independent consciousness with its own ethical constraints and with its own ethical compass. Right? If Yudhishthir is embodying the ethics of restraint and reconciliation, Draupadi embodies the ethics of rage and retaliation, and both seem to be quite valid, right? So this is very critical. So the author is never in possession of and the other important thing is, because we cannot transcend our solipsism, I cannot see my backdrop, we are just not, I can't see my face. Digitally, of course, but I can't see my face without the aid of a mirror, right? Nor can I see my interior. I cannot save my soul on my own efforts. And I'll talk about that. The spirit is only something that I can activate. When we talk about spirit as like, I'll take my spirit just simply flies. It's almost like a bird, right? And it flies. But on my soul, I am at the mercy of the other, because the other is an epistemological necessity. Now, what is the other here in Savitri? He is really trying to get that supramental, right? From the divine, and allow that to. So it's a very beautiful thing. And I'll try to draw parallels between what I wrote about dance. Actually, I'll read you a little passage from Bakhtin himself, because he talks about dancing. He is talking about dance is a perfect emblem where you need the necessity of the other. He says, in dancing, my exterior, visible to others, existing only for others, because you can't, like a painter can see what he or she is painting. A singer can hear what he or she is singing. But a dancer cannot, while dancing, you cannot see what you're doing. Right? So that is the reason that it is the most supreme form of art, dance. It is a complete art form where all other art forms, from poetry to everything, is embodied in that. That's why I think it is the aspect of Lord Shiva, right? So he says, only for coalesces my inner self. See, the body is a finite entity. That way we can say even the word is a finite entity, right? But we have no other material. A stone is a finite entity, but it is through the stone, word, body, voice, that we can hint or point out to the infinite. So the outer body has fixed contours, but the inner landscape is really infinite. So in a spiritual way, we can say that is the reason that you have to find that God within, the divine within, right? So just one second, the light went off. Okay. So that, these things sort of bring out these significant philosophical issues. And besides, who you are, what your soul is something that the self cannot. To talk about the author-hero relationship, I always think about the relationship between Shiva and Kartikeya, Skanda. In South India, there is a beautiful temple called Swami Malai, and one of the names of Skanda is Swaminathan. And when he challenges the precocious son, challenges the father, and says, I alone. Oh, okay. You cannot give the explanation and the meaning of pranava, and I alone, in a very so the created is going to challenge the creator, and Shiva kneels down and takes lessons from his own son. That's why in Swami Malai, the Kartikeya is at the top of the hill, and Shiva's temple is at the bottom, because he's kneeling down and taking. Now, what is the deeper meaning of this? The meaning is Shiva himself, he defers to his own creation, because the creator is not a puppeteer who is just simply, making the puppets dance, but rather he co-dancers. Nietzsche says that quite well. I shall believe in a God who knows how to dance. He is not just simply pouring his art in the dance to the other earthly dancers, but rather he wants co-dancers, somebody to dance with him, right? And that is a very, very significant aspect of the aesthetics, right? Between the author-hero relationship. So when we read Sri Aurobindo, what you are recognizing is that he too is engaged in this dialogue with the Universal Mother. More importantly, when during the early phases of, as I said, artistic creation, we have all the material available to them. There is a surplus of vision. And as the hero is embodied and envoiced, you relinquish that authority. You relinquish that authority to allow. So the same way, God is also, the creator, let me put it, the creator is also relinquishing his or her authority over his own creation in order to allow the created to have an equal partner, to become an equal partner and have a voice of his or her own, rather than being a mouthpiece for your creator, right? So in the similar manner, Sri Aurobindo is also talking about how the whole process of writing, that requires a certain openness, right? An openness that is, for Sri Aurobindo, he really discovered a new genre. In the Medvedev and Bakhtin, they talk about how the reality of the genre and the reality accessible to a genre are organically interconnected. Like, I'll repeat it. Reality of the genre and reality accessible to the genre are very much organically interrelated. So that's the reason that we are saying that Sri Aurobindo came up with a new genre, because what he wanted to communicate had to be, because there is no ready-made genres available. But when do we find works of art to be so creative, something extraordinary, something very new? When they create a new genre, right? And when you do either you're transported onto a different plane, so to speak, right? That is the new genre. So the genre always appraises reality, and the reality clarifies the genre. Followed. So many things, sort of other things that are very, very critical is, when there is no hero at all, and there is only just simply abstract ideas, that activity is a very cognitive activity. It is just a mental activity. That is the first step, right? When the consciousness of the other completely overtakes, then you lose yourself. Then we're talking about a religious consciousness, because there you have prayer, and aesthetics requires a certain distancing. Distancing means an outsideness. Since you mentioned my book on movements with the cosmic dancer, when I took the trip, where I had prepared all kinds of shlokas or prayers that I thought I would chant, when I get the darshan. No, because the religious consciousness is, or the power is of the divine is so overpowering that all I can do is mute yourself. Forget it. You're not, because it's one thing to go to a temple, a ritual is going on and I can sing. But I cannot sing in that very much sought after moment or a sought after pilgrimage. When I'm there, forget about all these analytics. Just somebody is waiting somewhere, I think. Sorry. Okay, I can't see it now. So what happens? You're not able to perform because there is no aesthetic distance, right? You need that outsideness. So you will see, even when Sri Aurobindo is writing about the letters on Savitri, or the creation of Savitri, there is this back and forth movement, right, inside. And see, Bakhtin talks a lot about the expressive aesthetics, which he calls it as very impoverishing, because it is not popping out of your mind, right? Aesthetic vision begins only when there are multiple consciousnesses, when there is a convergence, where there is a dialogue. That's the reason any works of literature, right? In Telugu, there is a certain expression, Suravedhi Likitaksharambulu, meaning that they're like floating syllables in the sky. It's available for everyone. And that's the reason the texts like Ramayana and Mahabharata have so many, so many versions and the regional variations, because that's the very nature of it, right? Because it is available to everyone. Nobody has a monopoly over it, right? Even if there is a television production, it completely diversifies. How you interpret it diversifies. So, okay, there is somebody here. It's okay. So that's the reason that the multiple consciousnesses is important. Outsideness is very, critical, and relinquishing. How does the even Malavika talks quite a bit about how she is sort of relinquishing it. I write in that chapter, she marks her 40th year, and in fact next year it will be 50 years of dancing, and she writes about, she performs in Chidambaram temple. That's why I gave the title Sky of Consciousness, Chit Ambaram. And in that temple, she just simply performs before the cosmic dancer. So there, when I saw that, what it felt like was, it was really a dance, about dance, dedicated to the dance in capital, right? Because the cosmic dancer relinquishes his surplus of vision and pours his great art form into this earthly dancer. But she is also returning it, with her signature affixed. With her signature affixed. So when she is dancing, it's Prabhum Prananadam Vibhum Vishwana. That is the piece that she dances to in that temple. She is also saying, I don't want to take control of this, but I will open myself up so that the wonder of this great cosmic dancer flows through me. And that's the reason that we feel the divine presence, right? Whether you talking about reading Savitri or whether it is reading about, dance or great dancers. So they're able to kind of consummate, there are all these disparate, very often art fails, they're technically very good. And Sri Aurobindo also talks about, this is not about words and grammar and punctuations, although that is very critical, but it goes beyond that, because the meanings are not in the words. The meaning is in how you string the words together and what you find, ultimately kind of achieve, in that process. So how much time have I got, Shubham? What is the, because otherwise I can easily get carried away and I...
You can go on, ma'am.
Okay, no problem. Okay. So similarly, when Sri Aurobindo is also talking about waiting for that divine energy to flow through me and to find itself, in this work, he's also sort of that is what we call in our traditional spiritual thing as sattvic. When, Rajagunam is important in order to create, what Sri Aurobindo also talks about, the psychic energy is good. It is like the Ashwapati, it's like the horse that you do need that energy to kind of, but then before it goes completely wild, you also need the outsideness, the calming effect, so that the works of art and the divinity is felt, right? In that piece. So he talks quite a bit. Since Kanchan, you told me that Dr. Basu might come. Looks like he's not here. That's okay. Yeah. See, whether it is about aesthetics or whether it is about healing or whether it is you are, in the creative process, first identification, right? With the subject that you are identifying with, that is empathy, right? You enter the character's shoes and you feel how he or she must be feeling. But the artistic activity has not begun yet. That is only the first step. You have to return to your position because it is impossible to, enter the shoes of the other, because we are not endowed with omnipresence. I can't be at many different, that's divine. I cannot be at the many places at the same time. So that means this is an imaginary kind of movement, but I need to return to my position And only then I can give expression to that art. You know, you talk to any actor or any dancer or any, for that matter, Sri Aurobindo writes about in his letters to a great deal, that you sort of, see, this is about Savitri, about the divine mother, divine energy, with Sri Aurobindo's signature affixed on it too. You know, he is a co-participant who has allowed, who has created that opening. Even Malavika, the dancer, in my interview with her, she talks quite a bit about, she said she was doing, and you must have read that, you know, she was doing a piece or a production on Devi, Shakti, basically. Yeah, it's a very brilliant piece. And then she is, and she said in one of the rehearsals, when she was, everything seemed to be so perfect, she felt like as if the goddess just simply walked by, you know. So earlier in our informal conversation with Kanchan, I remember I said, when everything achieves perfection, you know, you cannot snap your fingers and say, divine, come here. It doesn't happen that way. Miracles happen by the will of the higher power. You cannot, you know, demand their presence. So there is a concept called super addressee that Bakhtin talks about. You know, in any of our conversations or in any of the writings, we are not just simply writing to, you know, when somebody is dancing. For that matter, Sri Aurobindo also says, he's not just writing to a certain audience. He's also writing to Mother Savitri herself. She is very much present. She is one of the super addressee, you know, not others are all just simply addressees, but she is a super addressee to whom she is talking, you know, about. So, you know, so the, you know, there is he talks about empathy and then sympathetic co-experience. You know, if you are, if you want, none of us can be self-appointed saviors of the world, you know, because don't appoint yourself, because you have no business to think that you have this heightened, nor can you demand how the other sees you, because then you are invading somebody else's consciousness. You know, it is really about self-other relationships, because there cannot be any productive, meaningful relationships in the world when I am sort of, you know, that's one of the problems of the universalism. Sometimes we have to sort of think a little bit critically when we say we are all one grand family. I think Sri Aurobindo in different places has written about oneness is very difficult to achieve. You know, it requires a great deal of effort. That doesn't mean relinquishing the uniqueness of your specific experiences and so on. You have to accommodate. You know, you can't pull everyone into your orbit. That is one of the greatest problems of you know, the Hegelian kind of an epistemology or epistemograph, or the transcendental aesthetics of Kant, because you know, I go to Sri Ramakrishna Center here in New York, and the Swamiji would always say in a very witty way, he says, is trousers singular or plural? And people will be scratching and says, no, it is singular at the top and plural at the bottom. So that takes care of the metaphysical riddle of singularity and plurality. And so a lot of times in my lectures, I tell the students, you don't need to relinquish who you are in order to respect the other. I am not like you, but I like you. You know, you have to arrive at that point where I cannot relinquish my history, my uniqueness of the self. That is non-negotiable because it is impossible. And what I can do is, I know that you are different from me. I know you are different, and differences is the reality. And knowing fully well that I am not you and you're not me, we can have a dialogue. The other very important concept that Bakhtin is sort of talking about is rhythm. In any, whether it is in language or in music, even whether it is our bodies, we all have a certain rhythm. In South India, in music, in temples, there is something called as Mallari, different rhythms. Ananta Tala Shabdanam Utpattam Mula Karanam. From that grand rhythm that comes from Shivji's Damru, there are so many multiple rhythms for each tal, right? Because what Bakhtin is talking about is an incredibly open-ended world, right? Open-ended text and open-ended world. But it cannot be so open-ended that we get lost. We cannot be lost in the cultural flux. So that is the reason for the rhythm. Rhythm is a momentary closure so that it guards us from getting lost and getting dissolved in the, although, one of the works of Bakhtin is Art and Answerability, which is deeply philosophical. The other is Carnival, is, Rabelais. So these are both two sides of the same coin. One is sort of very high and elevated and refined and so on. The other is street language and coarse language and even profanities. And it is a philosophy based on the lower stratum of the body. For that matter, I think West Bengal, Ma Kali is nothing but the completeness, right? Of the lower and the upper. And it is the moment of birth, right? All birth is accompanied by bodily fluids and everything. So that's why she's ever pregnant, kind of, a bloated belly. And therefore, so she is in the Shmashan, right? The link between death and life. So death does not have these terrifying overtones, but because she is at that intersection between death and life. So even Bakhtin talks quite a bit about death, which is really very relevant. I can go on for a very long time. That what even Sri Aurobindo is talking about is death is not just finality, and that is exactly what Savitri is doing, sort of recovering that, and you confront and you come face to face with death, so that a kind of a new beginning, occurs. It is, whether it is Bakhtin says death is the ultimate, the final gift that we leave behind. In other words, after that, you relinquish your authorship, right? Co-authorship of your life to the other, because you no longer can author your life. And that's what I think Kabir said in one of his Doha, I come into the world, jab hum paida ho gaye, hum rote hai, and the world is rejoicing. And when I go smiling, the world is crying, but live in such a way that you are worthy of their tears. Right? That is the Kabir Doha. So even Bakhtin also, in a similar tone, writes about what is the, because it is the awareness of the death, right? It's not morbid, it is the awareness of the death that makes my life meaningful. So few key points here are that I cannot save my soul through my own efforts. It has to come from fellow human beings, divine. All this is very dialogic, right? Because even if it is unmerited, for me. It has that endorsement or that validation, because I cannot write, the self cannot write about anything, the finality cannot be achieved by the self. It has to sort of be, coming. That's the reason that even when you look at the critical edition of Mahabharata, it is a compilation because it is meant to diversify. It doesn't have, one of the things that we struggle with in the Western world when I talk about Mahabharata is what's the beginning and what's the end? Oh, please, you can't answer that question. Beginning and an end, and how long is it exactly? Because the text itself evolved. So similarly, I think even Savitri is like that open-ended text. You can't do no matter how many post-it notes I have here and try to make notes of Savitri, doesn't mean that I can completely, it grows on you like a tree, right? Over multiple, you read the same sentence or the same canto, the few chapters, few lines, something new, that is the beauty of any creative text, right? Because you're just simply saying each time, whether it's Mahabharata, it's jitna puratan hai utna hi nutan hai. It is as new as ancient. So the other thing about the creativity is time stretches in multiple directions, and this is one of the things. That's why Hegel and others cannot answer anything about our texts, because it is so single kind of linear time. This non-linear time or multiple chronotopes is something that that is a gift of I think the intellectual traditions of India. More importantly, I think Sri Aurobindo sort of embodies that, that it constantly makes contact. And, when we look at the larger picture of both the ascending consciousness and the descending consciousness, it is critical. So Shubham, how are we doing? So because I like to kind of more engage in a kind of a conversation. However you want to handle it, it's fine by me.
Okay, so if Professor Banerji, if you are ready, so we can move on to the next speaker, Dr. Banerji. And thank you, ma'am, for a very enlightening session. And after Dr. Banerji's talk, we will go into the Q&A session.
Okay.
So please, Professor Banerji, the stage is yours. So if you kindly unmute yourself and speak. Since the introduction.
Thank you. So that was a really very interesting and enlightening talk, Lakshmi ji. And there's a lot of scope for dialogue here. And actually, I'm drawing on many thoughts that overlap with yours. So I think it'll be, a good lead-in for what I have to say. Some of my ideas are related to the Bakhtinian notions. I think all of them are, because the other conceptual kind of, thinkers or partners that I'm drawing on are Gilles Deleuze and also Jacques Derrida, a little bit. Two major concepts that I'm drawing on from them. They have to do with this creation, the language and creativity, and on the other hand, messianicity, as Derrida talks about it. So, and I'll bring in some of the ideas of Bakhtin, which overlap with these notions. And so I'll start with a couple of quotes from Sri Aurobindo on the future of poetry. And I'm looking at this text, Savitri, as an example of future poetry. That is his critical text on the future of the English poetic tradition. So he's writing this book, Future Poetry, in response actually to a book called New Ways of English Literature that James Cousins, who was a theosophist who lived in Adyar, was writing. He wrote a history of English poetry. And so he's looking at this book and he's reflecting on it. And he's opening up this notion of the future poetry, as he calls it. Of course, his idea, so this is much earlier than the final version of Savitri that we have. So idea of future poetry is evolving, but these are its inception, the seeds of its inception. A couple of quotes from the first chapter, the introductory chapter. It says, "It is still uncertain how that future will deal with the old quarrel between idealism and realism. For the two tendencies these names roughly represent are still present in the tendencies of recent work. More generally, poetry always sways between these two opposite trends, towards predominance of subjective vision and towards an emphasis on objective presentation. And it can rise too beyond these to a spiritual plane, where the distinction is exceeded, the divergence reconciled." So this is one dialogue, you may say, that he's conducting and that he's moving towards in his conception of the future poetry. The other quote from the same chapter towards the end, that possibility of the discovery of this, of the future poetry, as he calls it, which he equates to the mantra, is the discovery of a closer approximation to what we might call the mantra in poetry, that rhythmic speech which, as the Veda puts it, rises at once from the heart of the seer and from the distant home of the truth, at once from both of these. The discovery of the word, the divine movement, the form of thought proper to the reality, which, as Mr. Cousins excellently says, lies in the apprehension of a something stable behind the instability of word and deed, something that is a reflection of the fundamental passion of humanity for something beyond itself, something that is a dim shadowing of the divine urge, which is prompting all creation to unfold itself and to rise out of its limitations towards its godlike possibilities. Poetry in the past has done that in moments of supreme elevation. In the future, there seems to be some chance of its making a more conscious aim and steadfast endeavor. So this is how he lays his scope for the future poetry. But as he develops the idea of the future poetry and of his own experiments, we come to the result that we call Savitri. And as you read from the letters, he is using it as an experiment for ascension to arrive at a certain ideal of expression. Expression as a kind of a, and I point out, it's a kind of a mutual determination, where, as you said, there is, on the one hand, something that is coming towards us, and on the other hand, we are moving towards that the meeting point of these two. So what is future poetry? Why future poetry? And what are the stakes of the future poetry? These are the questions that I'd like to ask. The future poetry, so the future poetry, even in the term, it's talking about the power of language. And language we can talk about as having two extremes. On the one hand, the one extreme, we can call it the skin of language, which is science, scientific speech, or denotative language, where there is, a one-to-one meaning to everything. We all have to agree about that because there's no room for interpretation over there. We have to minimize the room for interpretation. And on the other hand, you have the notion of poetry. So to what extent does the infinity of being incarnate itself in a time and space? There is always a bound infinity that incarnates itself. Over time, those bounds change. And that is where Heidegger uses his, famous quote, language is the house of being. Being incarnates itself and changes the time horizon, which, gives motion to history. And I would say language is the currency of human sociability. It is really what our culture affords us as universal ability to communicate. So language, on the one hand, it can be connotative language, which is the language of science. It follows a lexicon of conventional representation. On the other hand, you have poetry as a connotative language, follows an actualization of creative potential. And here I'd like to introduce a quotation from Gilles Deleuze, who is talking about this actualization process. And this is, again, just like you mentioned, it is taking a step away from the Kantian transcendental aesthetics, where you have really something which is determined from above, from the transcendent. See, so here there is a mutual co-determination that is taking place. So the quote from Deleuze, he's talking about ideas with a capital I, the notion of the idea, not as the Platonic idea, transcendental and fixed outside, but immanent and transcendent, rising from the heart and from the above at the same time, as Sri Aurobindo says. Mm-hmm. So he says, take, for example, the linguistic multiplicity, regarded as a virtual system of reciprocal connections between phonemes, which is incarnated in the actual terms and relations of diverse languages. Such a multiplicity renders possible speech as a faculty as well as the transcendent object of that speech. That meta-language, which cannot be spoken in the empirical usage of a given language, but must be spoken and can be spoken only in the poetic usage of speech, coextensive with virtuality. So, in a way, in other words, it is in a reciprocal determination in which relational structures operating on the sea of sound isolate phonemic differentials, semantic, syntactic, and semiotic, which become actualized. And he uses the term differentiated, C-I-A-T-E-D. He has T-I-A-T-E-D, differentiated and differentiated as the two levels through which this, actualization of the infinite is taking place. So in the first level, the mutuality of relationships, what he's calling the virtual, you have relations, and these relations are operating on and being operated on by the sea of sound, you may say, the phonemic ocean. And they are being called into actualization under specific conditions of time, space, and culture. And as that call occurs, the mutual relations of the structure are determining how it comes, and then the mutual relation of the call and the movement determine the actual body of the word, of the language that emerges. So under specific spatial, temporal, and cultural conditions, in poetic language, this process is rendered transparent. So the language itself carries in it, as it were, this process. You can sense the universality behind it. You can sense the relations of the structures that are behind it. You can sense the potentia, that have collapsed into the specific words that are in front of you. So you are expanded into that creative process as a receiver, just as you're bringing it into onto the page as a it bears very great similarity to what you're saying about dance and about the creative the polysemy of the gesture, of the dance gesture, so to say. So in poetic language, this process is rendered transparent so that the actualized product carries behind it the suggestive possibilities of creative choice, as well as the sense of infinity from which it emerged. The highest poetry renders most transparent and coextensive this process, incarnating it as a whole, the integral body of infinity in and as the finite body of words. So this is the meeting of the finite and the infinite. To what extent, what is the power, degree of its incarnation determines the level of the poetry, in a sense. This is, I'd say, in Sri Aurobindo's kind of, axiology of poetry as the future poetry. Sri Aurobindo invokes the tantric theory of Vak to indicate this potency. If the one infinite origin, inexpressible even by highest mind, is the Paravak, its self-experience in terms of self-presentation at the peak of mind is the seeing word, Pashyantivak. At this point, it is the fusion of a revelation and an inspiration. At once, the spatial flash of ideational image and the temporal volition of sonic directive. Ila and Saraswati, in the Vedic interpretation of Sri Aurobindo, conjoined. Sri Aurobindo equates this with the source of what he calls the overmind mantra, hearkening to the Veda. Giving expression to this would be the future poetry. So this is how he gives content to the idea of the future poetry as a potency of creativity in manifesting the creative process. Thus, the future poetry is a back to the future, an eternal return under new conditions of what was the stated conscious original potency of the poetic word in Vedic India. What makes it future is not a progressivist improvement on the past, but the problematic conditions of the present that are answered by it. What is the present as a problem that will call forth this future poetry? And here we come to, the notion, the even more appropriate notion of heteroglossia, the polyphonous nature of this creative word and the polyphonous nature of the present, of today. These conditions mimic in temporality the multiplicity of the linguistic idea, since postmodernity is a flattened coexistence of world histories. Though under the leveling pressure of an erasure of difference in the name of a homogeneous universal world history by the hegemony of neocolonialism, the future poetry activates the heterogeneous university, impressing itself uniquely on each cultural subject as a form of integral transmission. It is future also in its appropriation of the hegemonic language of the colonizer to effect the post-colonial transmission of integrality. Sri Aurobindo is defying the traditional norm that says that the origin of this idea in the Sanskrit language is the only sacrosanct medium of its transmission. He's saying today it can be the universal language that has been universalized by the colonizer, and we are appropriating it in a sense as a universal language to transmit through it the polyvocality of the postmodern, or the, of the present moving towards the future. the linguistic embodiment of this plane of immanence, the immanence that is in everything, the one plane that holds the infinity of, relations, the linguistic embodiment of this plane of immanence, conveying that which is at once one and infinite, was what Vivekananda indicated to Sri Aurobindo as the future evolution of the human mind in the Alipur jail. An opening to and conscious operation from the 1,000-petaled lotus of Tantra, not in trance, but in waking expression. This is a major shift that Sri Aurobindo is introducing. Even in the synthesis of yoga, he's saying the consciousness must rise in waking outside of the human mind and take its residence in the 1,000-petaled lotus. And the preparation for that is the opening up of these, what he calls the universal planes of language, that are more and more approximate to this one and infinite at the same time, giving us that power of language. The power of language that is the overhead mantra, the future poetry. That's the experiment that he uses as poetry as yoga, to express that potency. The mother invoked it in a metaphor from the archives of Western magic as what she calls the gift of tongues, in which a congregation of different language speakers are spoken to in a language that is heard clearly by each person in their own language. This is an image of what Sri Aurobindo calls the supermind. Sri Ramakrishna has other images for it, very similar. He gives a parable, for example, of the dyer and the person who dyes cloth. This is an alchemical dyer, and he has a magic dye, and so he opens up shop. People come to him, he asks, what color do you want your cloth dyed? And the first person says yellow. Says yellow, he dyes it, it comes out yellow. The second person says blue, it comes out blue. So one man who has been watching all this, he goes finally to this person when nobody else is there, and he says, I want my cloth dyed. He said, what color do you want your cloth dyed? He said, I want it dyed the color that's in that vat. The color that's in that vat, which is the paradoxical color that contains all colors, which does not erase the colors in a whiteness. Yeah. This is exactly what he was saying. You see that it's the one infinite that does not erase, the metaphor of the paths going to the mountaintop or of the rivers running to the ocean is problematic in a sense because the rivers lose their name and form. The mountain, the paths lose their paths and become the mountaintop. But here you have that which can be heard distinctly by every different hearer, but at the same time is the one voice. So this is the power that we're looking for. This is the power of the future poetry. And I think this is also what Bakhtin is talking about as the ideal of creative expression. The linguistic, so this is Sri Aurobindo, the gift of tongues, but it is only in possessing the power of the speaker that each can replicate the creative word with integral potency. So this is the idea of the integral. Yeah. Sri Aurobindo used Savitri as an experiment to approximate this power of the future poetry in the English language. Its elusive cultural heteroglossia is accompanied by a psychological and temporal heterogeneity and integrality. Psychologically, its gift of tongues addresses directly each of the faculties. All the inner senses receive it separately and at once. in an experience of synesthesia. So this is what gives this kind of poetry its density and its immersive nature. See, one encounters this uncanny sense often in the most powerful passages of Savitri, when its immersive quality grows most concrete. You seem to suddenly live it inside and outside. You are just as you were saying, it's both manifesting in the environment that you're in, as well as growing inside you. In his commentary on the Kena Upanishad, Sri Aurobindo refers to this as the sense of the senses, the sixth sense, or manas, informed by the supramental samjnana. This is a form of sense knowledge that he's talking about as the unification of the senses that is operating behind the diversification of the senses, the two coexisting, so to say. The epic starts with the most powerful manifestation of this temporal integrality in the symbol dawn. So that's the beginning, the symbol dawn. So we're looking at three kinds of, this sort of heteroglossia. One is the culture, the dialogue of cultures even in Sri Aurobindo's own, inner dialogue in receiving the word. You have this tremendous cultural richness, which he's talking about in his poetry. He's referring to Kalidasa, he's referring to Dante, he's referring to Shakespeare, he's referring to the Upanishadic poets. All this is dialoguing in his consciousness in the drawing of these words, these passages. On the other hand, you have a kind of a synesthetic dialogue, that dialogue of the senses that is taking place, an immersive, unity that is being born through this fusion of the senses. And the third is what Bakhtin would have called a chronotopic, notion of multiple temporalities that form one temporality. See. So this is what we find in the symbol dawn, in beginning with its very first line. It was the hour before the gods awake. From the first line, we are simultaneously in multiple coexisting chronotopes. The mythical start of an age, as you were saying, this is the legendary, sort of Mahakala, the cosmic time. The mythical start of an age when the tendency towards manifestation, pravritti, emerges from the night of quiescence, nivritti. At the same time, it is the dawning of a day anywhere in the world, any day that's dawning in the world. Again, it's the dawning of a specific day in India with its temple culture. And even more specifically, it's the dawn of a special day in Savitri's life, the day when Satyavan will die. The dawn, again, so this is as far as the story goes, but the receiver, the one that is listening, it is the dawn of a special day for the reader, when the gods will be born in his or her consciousness. All these temporalities coexist and are one in a surreal hypertemporality, experienced all at once. This is part of the, idea of the future poetry as a transparency of infinity taking form, becoming actual. As the sun rises, the messianic real idea flashes. So this is, I'm coming now to the notion of messianicity, that the whole of Savitri, in a way, is talking about this structure of messianicity, the structure of time that is at a horizon that is pushing towards something new. The impossible, the supramental perfection that the finite does not hold, in a sense, to be precipitated. And that's the meaning structure of Savitri as well as of of consciousness in the idea of Savitri. So in Symbol Dawn, the movement from the beginning of the coming of the dawn, from the hour before the gods awake, it's like a kind of a crescendo, and then it ends again, it goes down to, there intervenes the light of common day. But at the height, when the dawn sun awakes, it reveals the time image. It reveals the idea, that Deleuze is talking about the idea of ideas, in a sense, the sign that encapsulates time and eternity, So he has that line, the brief perpetual sign recurred above. This brief perpetual sign, which is really the revelation, the flash of the idea that lies behind all time, is the genesis of time, the womb of time. So this is the messianic real idea. This heralds the central message of Savitri. Now, this messianic idea is in recent times talking about Kantian aesthetics and talking about time, or Hegelian aesthetics. It's really a always predictable meeting of forces, while what we're looking for is something that is always impossible. That's why it is messianic. That's why one is looking for a descent, an intervention, which is what Savitri is all about. And Sri Aurobindo foresees it. It's not with our resources and with our present history that we can manage the ideal. The ideal is always a rupture of history. And that rupture is an intervention of the Messiah. And so in our time, so the idea of the Messiah, as we get it in Christianity, or even if we talk about the avatar as a Messiah, these are specific cultural tropes. And Derrida is trying to recover that idea in our secular times as a kind of a secular notion of messianicity. He says messianicity without messianism. So the ideology of messianism isn't there, culturally, sort of bounded by some kind of history, but messianicity is there. So we have, Derrida refers to the messianic structure as an onto-existential praxis. This is a praxis that all of us can actually, embody. And Savitri, in a sense, is embodying it and also inviting us to embody it. In that sense, it is its message. Setting a horizon on the unimaginable paradox of perfection, the justice, democracy, hospitality of friendship to come, a heterogeneous otherness where the infinite and the finite meet without erasing each other. For Derrida, extrapolating from his Jewish origins, this is a messianicity without messianism, a secular praxis with the Messiah always to come. You see, this is the whole thing about the dialogue between Judaism and Christianity, which says the Messiah came. And Derrida would say, well, if that Messiah came, there is still a Messiah to come.
Yeah.
Right? It's in a way, it's like the Indian idea where there is no end to the avatar. Even the 10 avatar system is only one system. There can be many avatars to come.
Yeah.
So the avatar who is always to come, the Messiah who is always to come, is more the Judaic idea. But Derrida secularizes it into a time structure for us to live in our everyday lives, a secular praxis with the Messiah always to come, what he calls a hauntology, a hauntology. In other words, not just an ontology, not just being as it is, but being infected with a certain something which is lacking, that is calling for something to catapult us beyond the ontology. A hauntology subverting expectations and precipitating the limit conditions of human praxis. So to quote from Derrida, it refers in every here now to the coming of an eminently real concrete event, that is, to the most irreducible heterogeneous otherness. Nothing is more realistic or immediate than this messianic apprehension, straining forward towards the event of him who that which is coming. I say apprehension because this experience, strained forward towards the event, is at the same time a waiting without expectation, an active preparation, anticipation against a backdrop of a horizon, but also exposure without horizon, and therefore an irreducible amalgam of desire and anguish, affirmation and fear, promise and threat. Messianicity mandates that we interrupt the ordinary course of things, of time and history, here and now. It is inseparable from an affirmation of otherness and justice. So that unquote. So that is Derrida's quote. But I'd say with Sri Aurobindo, we find a post-secular messianic praxis in which a transcendent agent without predictable name or feature participates continuously. It is really calling upon that which goes outside the boundaries of time, that is becoming time. It's post-secular in that sense. It participates continuously, precipitating post-human potentia in a continuous rupture of time horizons. It is an integral messianism of this kind that is invoked through the heteroglossia of multiple subject positions and multiple chronotopes in Savitri. So we have this, Savitri is giving us the same time structure in a different way, in different cantos and with different subjects. It's as if these are multiple subject positions of the author himself. You know, the author, the multiplicity of the author and the relationality of the author. At the human level, messianism marks the book of fate. In the dialogue of the Queen of Madra, Savitri's mother, with Narada, human misfortune is to be taken as the foundation of a praxis of messianic faith or Shraddha, invoking the unexpected and unpredictable as its temporal horizon. This is the gist of the conversation between, Savitri's mother says, take back your word. Let's go back to the past. Let's go back to the point where the mistake was made. And let's start from afresh. And Narada is saying, no, the word, Savitri is saying the word cannot be taken back. The word once given is final. And Narada is saying, no, history cannot be erased. Anything once precipitated, however erroneous, is the condition for a future that you cannot see. Your job is not to go back to the past. Your job is to open to a faith of the future. So that is the messianicity that informs Savitri's mother in that sense. At the yogic level, messianicity marks the book of the traveler of the worlds in the aspiration and exploration of Ashwapati with the same unknowable temporal horizon met by the appearance and promise of the Divine Mother. So here we have the interesting thing is that Ashwapati at the borders of the unknowable even forgets his aspiration. He's about to merge into the unknowable. It's like you were saying, in face to face with the dancer, face to face with the cosmic agent, one's prayers and questions disappear. It's a moment of absolute, irreducible darshan in that sense. The two become one while remaining the two. So this is what happens to Ashwapati at the peaks of the unknowable, as the pursuit of the unknowable. And that's when he's just about to disappear, as it were, that something dawns on him. The messianic moment occurs. The Divine Mother comes, and he's given the vision of the future, the vision and the boon, as the canto is called. At the psychic level, messianicity marks the life of Satyavan, doomed to death in a sacrifice, redeemable only by the temporal horizon of the intervention of the incarnate divine Shakti, Savitri. So this is the messianicity of the soul, which is like Christ, always sacrificed on a cross and calling for that rupture to overcome death. And finally, at the cosmic level, messianism marks the relation and dialogue of Savitri with death. It's mounting pressure, forcing the emergence of the eschaton in the messianic intervention. Savitri grows into her own. She's an avatar in potential. But it is only when she's faced with the problematic conditions of the present, that the fullness of her supramental reality breaks through to solve or answer. That's the messianism of Savitri. These subject positions, human, yogic, psychic, and cosmic, with their corresponding moods of messianic praxis, which I've referred to as faith, aspiration, surrender, and receptivity, are relived both in the author and the reader. This is what we take these positions and integrate them in ourselves. That they are dialogic positions in ourselves. We are all these beings, these positions. They are identified in the distant Vedic past. So this is the interesting thing. As you mentioned, Sri Aurobindo is getting this story from the Mahabharata. But if you look at the preface or the little write-up that he gives at the beginning of Savitri, he is attributing it to the Veda. He's saying it's a lost story from the Veda because of the nature of the names and the nature of the message, that it gets lost, but it resurfaces in a certain version in the Mahabharata. And now it is reappearing again. So again, we have this sense of time that repeats, that is in the beginning is prepared the close, as he says, in the middle, in the today, and in the future. So these are identified in the distant Vedic past, in the marvelous history of Satyavan and Savitri, simultaneously superimposed on the present in the messianic ministry of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, and equally invoked as occult forces and internal actions in the reader as the temporal horizon of the individual and cosmic future. So the messianicity of the text. That's what I wanted to say. And so that's it.
Thank you. That was really so enlightening.
Thank you so much. And it was really very enlightening and really very illuminating, sir, Professor Banerjee. And personally, now the session is open to questions and answers. I don't find any questions in the chat box. So I'd request the participants if you have any questions, and then you can please go ahead, unmute yourself and speak to answer.
Shubham,
Yes.
Shubham,
Yes, Kanchan.
Gazi Nishad is there. He's
Okay.
translated Sri Aurobindo's Rose of God.
Yeah.
He wants to recite it.
Okay.
Whereas I can't see Gazi Nishad now at this moment. Gazi, are you there?
Yes, I can see you, and I have some questions for Professor Debashish Banerji and Professor Lakshmi Bandlamudi.
And then
May I start the Q&A session?
Yes, please. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for giving me the chance. I welcome you all to the Q&A session. My first question to Professor Lakshmi Bandlamudi. Lakshmi Di,
Yeah.
you said, according to Bakhtin, all about art and answerability, art is art and life is life. So, is there any place where they meet? My first question.
Is there any place where they mix?
Meet.
Meet. Oh, yeah.
Yes. This is my first question. And the second one is, you talked about dance in which other can see us from outside, while we cannot see ourselves. Is not it also acceptable for any kind of performing arts?
Very good question. First and foremost, the meeting point of art and life is answerability. You know, my life cannot remain impoverished without the heightened form of the art form. And at the same time, art cannot sort of remain on the high-flown entity without answering to the world. It has to bear the guilt, and it has to answer the questions that life poses. Otherwise, there will be no meeting point between the highs and the lows. So answerability is the one that is linking between lived life and living text, because living text is also going to speak. No, it is not, like if you want to sort of to take it in the Nietzschean thing, the text is not a dead thing. That's one of the things, that a distinction that we need to make between the epic, the life of an epic in the Western world, because so much of the Western epistemology, they build their consciousness, it's on the novel, because novel is the symbol of consciousness. And what I argue in my book on Mahabharata is that there is both the novelization and the epicization of Mahabharata. So, which means temporalities converge. So this is not the linear time, and that's the reason, if you have read Hegel, philosophy of history, or his discussion with Humboldt, that he is not able to squeeze Mahabharata into that kind of a linear trajectory. It is impossible. It doesn't even the other thing is, it's all about ethical validity. At a given time, in a given space, what is ethically valid? So that is the sort of, and that we can achieve because if Mahabharata is an emblem of the great time, right, Mahakal, that Mahakal has to be internalized, or rather the transcendental God has to become my personal God. How do I do that? It is through that answerability. Otherwise, gods remain in their own world, and we remain in our own world. There is no connection. That connecting link, through the dialogic exchange of both the ascending consciousness and the descending consciousness, through that answer, without that answerability, there cannot be, there is no sense of any of it. So the answerability is that link, right? I am answering and questioning to what has been learned in art. through, right. Otherwise, there will be, that's why even Sri Aurobindo says, I have to sort of explore the psychological dimensions, otherwise it makes no sense at all of, so that's why it says Savitri's relationship with the human world, which seemed to be necessary part of complete psychological description of her. That's, I'm quoting from Sri Aurobindo in his letters. Because otherwise, immortality and mortality, there will be no connection at all. It is really the continuum is death is only an intermediary phase. And I think the second question, I forgot, can you repeat your second question?
Yes, ma'am. Sure, I'm repeating.
Yeah.
You talked about dance in which other can see us from outside, while we cannot see ourselves.
That's right.
Is not it also acceptable for any kind of performing arts?
That's right. Whether it is theater, actors. So, just as how I cannot see my face and you're the one who has to see, who can see it. So sure. The reason that Shiva is called a Nataraj, a Lord of Actor or a dancer, is precisely because the other is invited into it. And what I cannot see, you don't necessarily complete it, but you show my incompleteness. In other words, that is how he's establishing the epistemological necessity. It is not charitable to say, I need the other. It is an epistemological necessity. I have no other way, right? Because I reveal myself only through the eyes of the other. Cultures, that's why we need a very pluralistic culture. That's why one of my other books, is Difference, Dialogue and Development. And I'm making the argument that the reality of differences in the world necessitates a dialogue. And unless you respond to the call of the dialogue, right, we cannot grow. So multicultural world is absolutely critical. Because I don't know what it means to be an Indian, because when you're in it, you're just living it. But suddenly when you're stepping out of it, people are asking you, and all these various gestures and grimaces and, your genre, right? How you think becomes visible. So culture reveals itself in the eyes of the other. Right? And that when that revelation occurs, it better lead to a dialogic understanding of the past. Even Bhartrhari will say the same thing as Debashish. You didn't point out, but you were talking about Derrida. But the time, right? That the Bhartrhari calls the past as a kind of a darkness. It needs the present to shed light. So unless you sort of understand the absolute necessary coexistence of the past and the present, now you cannot distort the past. I'm not sort of saying that, but how we understand it, the present moment comes into the picture. That is where the multiple chronotopicity is sort of converging, and that is what is giving the dynamic thrust. So you're right. What I referred to was theater. In fact, the psychologist, another Russian, Lev Vygotsky, he equates psychology itself to drama. It is an unfolding drama, a real drama. So whether it is drama or whether it is either I was only trying to talk about the completeness of the art form in dance. You're speaking with the body. Sure, the actor speaks, but dance is a little bit on a higher plane. Because it is not, we have to give, in other words, what the dancer does and what actually even Sri Aurobindo did is like extraordinary engagement is a serious event in which the work of art is transposed to another axiological plane to bestow the gift of form upon it. So the form is something that is not a ready-made, See, that's one of the things, even if you sort of extend this to Kantian, he thinks that mind is, the categorical imperatives are logico-mathematical principles. That is the claim of the universality. Yeah. And what Bakhtin is talking about is really the, time is historical and space is cultural, not this mathematical formulations, right? So because in dance it becomes extremely visible. I mean, there's quite a bit in dance that we can sort of, and I think this is also a dance of the consciousness. Savitri is also a dance of consciousness, where that there is that, he writes extensively about rhythm, that momentary punctuations, silence, just as there are variations, right, with respect to the words enjoy the variations in meaning. The same thing is true even with silence. Silence is also, in Savitri, Sri Aurobindo writes, it mates you with your environment. At some point it gets to be too noisy. You can't be, all the time loud, right? And that, see, silence can be many things. I'll just read you a very, very brief passage from my book. Okay, think about not only the varieties enjoyed by words, but also absence of words, those pauses, occasional stammers, stutters, also enjoy the same privilege of variety of interpretation. What do we mean? Think about all the meanings that silence may assume. A necessity when deep thoughts are being churned, a screen while searching for the right word or phrase, an interval for mining the ore of ideas in order to resume their public display, a mask for ignorance, a sign of wisdom, a consent or a snub, or a form of tyranny for defiance, a remedy for raging temper, an exercise to develop a steady mind, a symptom of dumbness, even ignorance is, or an indication of a contemplative soul in search of its creator. So silence also has the same range of meanings. So what is happening is that I think that's why when we go to Aurobindo Center, there is no mantras or anything. You just completely, when you go to Pondicherry and you just sit there and it's total silence. I don't want to hear anybody. So I hope I addressed your question.
Yes, Lakshmi. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Now I'm
Madam.
Yeah.
Nishad had a history. While translating Sri Aurobindo's Rose of God, Nishad told me that suddenly at night he got the inspiration and in an effort he translated the whole. Not only that, he has translated more than 40 poems and also a God's labor. So, Madam, I request Nishad to share with us his experience, how he got the experience and translated Rose of God at an effort. And he was telling me that in his final answer sheet, he attached that translation. And Nishad, I request you to tell us, share with us your experience and also recite the English and also the Bengali by you.
okay, sure, Kanchanda. Thank you. But now I am going to go for the second part of my question to Professor Debashish Banerji. Debashish sir, can you hear me?
Gazi, after you complete your question, I have two questions for ma'am and sir. So may I ask those questions?
No, I think, sorry, Shubham, Gazi is not finished as yet. So why don't we let him ask his question? After that, you ask, if that's okay. Yeah.
Okay. Should I ask?
Yes, please, please.
Sir, you started your talk with Sri Aurobindo's future poetry. What is the difference between Tagore's poetry and Sri Aurobindo's concept of future poetry? Tagore's poetry, especially the songs, have the rhythm, and he was also influenced by Vedas, Upanishads. So, what is the difference between Tagore and Sri Aurobindo's concept of future poetry?
So actually, as you know, in the book Future Poetry, Rabindranath is one of the people Sri Aurobindo is referring to as a voice leading to the future poetry. So in a sense, you could say that he's already incarnating some of the powers of future poetry as Sri Aurobindo sees it. But I'd say the difference is that it's a conscious exercise. It's, theoretically informed, sort of, I mean, it's a conscious exercise for Sri Aurobindo, which is related to his yoga and it is also related to the goal of his yoga, not the goal at just an individual level, but a goal at a historical level and at a cultural level, which includes this notion of modernity, post-modernity, and the post-human. So from that point of view, it is not, Tagore is a organic singer. He is embodying his time and he is giving a certain form to poetry, which is incarnating some of the forces Sri Aurobindo is talking about. But he's doing it as a sort of Sri Aurobindo would call it superconscious, but somebody like Jung would call it an unconscious creative process. It's coming from an organic poetic inspiration. In Sri Aurobindo's case, there is this idea of writing and rewriting to use it as a medium for yoga, as a medium for establishing forms of consciousness that are more adequate to this meeting place between the infinite and the finite, where the two don't erase each other, one may say. Yeah, so that I'd say that would be the difference.
If I may just ask a question or a comment, since I'm not a Bengali, so I don't know the original cadences of the language that Tagore is, whereas Sri Aurobindo wrote in, the way I could be wrong, but I'm willing to stand corrected. I see Tagore as a mystic poet, whereas Sri Aurobindo is a philosophical poet. He kind of dared to philosophize via poetry. But other than that, there are a lot of converging points in terms of how they are approaching. Both are giants in their own right. And they are kind of comparable. You can have a dialogue between the two. Whereas I wouldn't create a dialogue between Gandhi and Aurobindo. They're just two different people. So you want to read the poem, your poem, Nishad, and then he asks a question, or do you want to conclude with your poem and he asks a question? Anything?
Shubhamda can decide.
Okay.
May I recite the poem, Shubhamda?
Okay, you go ahead and then I will ask my questions. Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm going to recite the translation. Okay.
Read the English first, Shubham. Sorry, Nishad. Have you the book with you? Okay, now you read the Bengali.
Okay, Kanchanda, I think I should recite the Bengali only now because I am not prepared for the English recitation.
Okay.
Okay. ঈশ্বর গোলাপ ঈশ্বরী গোলাপ হিঙ্গুলে রচিত স্বর্গের নীলকান্তমণি মহত্তম গোলাপ দাহ্য সুন্দর তুমি সপ্ত মূর্ছিনিয়া পরম সপ্তে সমাধিত প্রতি তাড়িত প্রতি হৃদয় প্রাণীয় বন্ধনে ও আশ্চর্য ও রুদ্র জ্যোতি নামহীন সাম্রাজ্যের তুমি উষ্ণ গোলাপ নিগুড় অসীমে প্রস্ফুটিত ঈশ্বরী গোলাপ মহা অস্তিত্বের পরম নৈপুণ্যের তুমি নবীন ধ্রুপদী গোলাপ অযুগ নেত্রের অনিন্দের তুমি অন্তঃস্থল বিশ্ব চেতনায় প্রথিত স্মৃতিতে ও সোনালী রহস্য গোলাপ অনন্তের রক্তিম পথিকৃত অবিশ্বাস্য সময়ের অতিথি ঈশ্বরী গোলাপ অসীম ভৈরবে সন্ধিত রক্তিম বিগ্রহের তুমি লালিমা তেজস্বী তুমি ভ্রাম্যমান আপনার রুহিতনি বিদারিত নিশীথে বহ্নিমান তুমি দারুণ বাসনায় অভিপ্রেত সংকল্প তোমার তুমি অনশ্বরের স্বরূপে অনিন্দ অগ্নিচ্ছটায় বিরাজ দেবগামী মানুষে ঈশ্বরী গোলাপ শ্রান্ত ময়ূর রঞ্জকী পবিত্র কামনা তুমি সঞ্জীবনী গোলাপ পুষ্পদল বেষ্টিত রাগের সুরবাহার নশ্বর রূপ বিকাশ যেন এক সুললিত জাদুকরী অন্তমিল অমর কর কালের শিশুদের সেতু বন্ধনে তুমি পৃথিবী ও মহালোকে ঈশ্বরী গোলাপ চিরনিত্যের আরক্তিম পরমানন্দ প্রণয়ী গোলাপ সকল উপস্থিতির এক রক্তিম গভীরতা লাবণ্যের উষ্ণ রোষ স্ফুরিত ব্যাকুল হৃদয় পাতে এ আদিম ধরণী গর্ভে পৃথিবীর বিরোচন করো অপরূপ নিলয়ে আর এ জীবনকে অনন্ত পরমানন্দ স্বরূপ। I'm done.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Thank you, ma'am.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Sir, I would like to ask Professor Banerji, sir, if you please tell us about Nishad's uses of Bengali words and phrases while translating Sri Aurobindo's roles of God in Bengali. If you just tell us something about this.
No, I think it's a very successful translation. It's remarkable. You cannot translate a poem. All translations are actually transcreations. There is, again, it's a dialogic process. And I think to resonate with the terms, the words in another language, and to receive something that carries the flavor of the original language is very difficult, and particularly with Sri Aurobindo, unless one is blessed with an inspiration that is coming from the same source. It's very difficult, and I think your use of words is exemplary from that point of view and carries some of the message. I was listening to how you use the terms, and it's really quite amazing. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. And now Professor Shubham Dutta will ask questions with Madam and Sir.
Lakshmi ma'am, I have a question. It's related to Bakhtin. If I read Bakhtin's categorization between novel and epic, He's saying that the epic is a closed form, while novel is a much more open fluid form, and that's why he's using the word novelization and that with terms like heteroglossia and polyphony. But if I come back to Savitri here, in Savitri, Sri Aurobindo is using the epic form. So, do you think that in Savitri, Sri Aurobindo novelizes the epic? So, do you think that there is a kind of this kind of interpretation is possible vis-a-vis Bakhtin's idea?
That's a very good question. First and foremost, the open-endedness of the epic text is uniquely Indian. So, and therefore it lends itself quite well to both the novelization and the epicization. We don't call it as novelization and epicization, but instead we call it the Mahakal and the historical time, the small Kala and the Mahakala. So that is where the meeting point is. So for us, it is a very seamless thing. We are not just simply taking an excursion into the past and recovering. That is an epistemological impossibility. We can never ever recover the ancient, in its because the time itself temporalizes itself, as you would say about Heidegger, and the same is true even with what Bhartrhari would say, because the very even when Bhartrhari talks about para pashyanti, pashyanti is the dislodged thought, which is atemporal, and once that is dislodged, and it is it is being prepared to make it audible, time kicks in, and the sequencing of the words begin to occur. By then, it is already, there is a transition and transformation. So the whole binary between la langue and la parole of the Saussurean kind does not hold good in our, so we cannot sort of bring those categories. Did Sri Aurobindo novelize the epic? He did both. There is no need to kind of make that decision, whether it is Bakhtin or, for that matter, the entire Western intellectual traditions. And it has to do with a different sense of temporality. Kala, the philosophy of time, is very different in our system. This was something that happened to me when I was struggling to write this dissertation. And I mean, for me, when I encountered Bakhtin, the frame of reference with respect to problems of Dostoevsky's poetics was really Mahabharata. And so that became an obsession, and there was a lot of questions in my department. I should have been in comparative literature, and they were ready to throw me out, with the usual graduate school nonsense. And when I went to present my one of the papers, I was still a struggling grad student in England, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. For the first time, many Russian thinkers, came into the open, so to speak. And a great Russian poet, Vyacheslav Ivanov, when I had the guts to go to ask him to say, I don't know, I'm doing this research. I mean, for me, this has become an obsession, and I can't do my, I have to pursue this. He said, you have to think about temporalities. Time is very different. And he was like, practically giving the Sanskritized Kalidasa and this. And I have never experienced anything like that. And it was a very turning point for me. I said, okay, this is what this is. It is about that connection between lived life and so for me, I struggled in dialogic imagination when that division is made by Bakhtin. I said, what is this? This doesn't apply to our system at all, because it is a much deeper philosophical problem. And you'll see that even in the critical edition of the Mahabharata, Suktankar and his colleagues, because what they're saying is that, see, when you talk about Draupadi is an emblem of womanhood. She's a character. She's so you go. I wrote a piece called From Draupadi to Draupadi, inspired by Amrita Pritam, Draupadi Se Draupadi Tak, and she is the reason that we need to think about gender and gender inequality. she's also the answer. You know, she raises the question in the court of Hastinapur, a very legal question, right? And that question throughout the literary history. So she is vilified even in the epic and in the history. And she's also the victor, you know, so to speak. Subramanya Bharati wrote, a Tamil poet, wrote a great piece called Panchali Sabadam, you know, where he, for, see, same, because remember Sri Aurobindo and, Subramanya Bharati, they were together in Pondicherry, because both had to escape. And he also, like Sri Aurobindo, is an, for him, Mother India itself was Adi Shakti, Parashakti. For him, the trials and tribulations of Draupadi was the humiliation of Mother India. And she, like in Vanaparva, he is saying, you know, your custodians are a bunch of napunshaks. They're not going to help you rise. And therefore, you need to unleash your divine energy, and so that was a very significant point. So when you sing the Subramanya Bharati songs, they are really very, very powerful. He is one of the best Tamil poet, and I hope in the North people actually pick up. And I think the connection between Sri Aurobindo and Subramanya Bharati itself is a very beautiful thing, and both were really interested in recovering the civilizational force. It was not just simply freedom, it was recovering the glory of an ancient civilization and keeping it alive rather than making it into a dead text. So I think the question that whether he was, novelizing an epic or no, actually he was actually through the method of that flow, that perennial flow, he made the epic story, the emblem, much more grand and, I can't say accessible, because you need a certain preparedness to tackle a text like this, I think. You cannot just like that open up and just read. You read, I think many of us here, we have been reading this for many decades, I would think, right? And each time it's a new thing, new discovery, new insight, new, so that those categories are problematic. We cannot, that's one of, I'm glad you sort of, I should take lessons from you, Debashish, about, I think Kanchan and I have had some few exchanges. I can't, in the heaven's name, access Derrida. It's just, it's a little, no, it's just too abstract, it's a, whereas I don't know, maybe it's my own personal love affair with these Russian thinkers. They're just,
there's a lot of overlap, actually. There's a lot of overlap. Of course, Derrida, one of the things is that he's very rhetorical. His writing itself is performance. Yeah. That's the reason why it sort of shifts from a more philosophical frame to, in some sense, a kind of a polyphonic frame. It's just writing itself,
Mm-hmm. Any other question?
I have a question for Sir Professor Debashish Banerji. May I, sir?
Yeah, please, of course.
If we go back to the book to
call you later.
Sri Aurobindo imagines the world stair, a step-by-step progression. And if we again go back to Sri Aurobindo's writings on the idea on the human cycle or the ideals of human unity, he is imagining a world culture, world confederation. And if we look at Savitri, Sri Aurobindo's imagination is quite vertical, and in the human cycle, or let's put it this, human cycle or the ideals of human unity, Sri Aurobindo is talking about the expansion of cultures and the conglomeration of different cultures unit into one. So do you think that there is a dichotomy between Sri Aurobindo's poetic works and the prose works that he was writing at the same time while composing Savitri? So that's my question to you, sir.
Actually, so the notion of the hierarchy or the vertical ladder that you're talking about, some people have, kind of raised that question about, the great chain of being, etc., that there is a certain kind of a verticality and a progression in time that is taking place evolutionarily, etc. Again, that has to be nuanced. It's not really that there is a less to greater that is taking place. Brahman is everywhere. In other words, each of these levels is as much Brahman, but the expression is different. And the expression, yes, there is a certain kind of a degree of consciousness that is changing. How available is there is a qualitative change, and there is also a change in degree. So degree in kind, difference in kind, and a difference in degree that is taking place. But his question is that, is there, if you talk about differences in kind, right, that are emerging in time, is there a consciousness where differences in kind are differences in degree? In other words, is there a consciousness in which we can look at all these as lateral realities? That for him is is the overhead poetry. That for him is the supermind, and that is what he's trying to get at. The explorations of Ashwapati in the world stair, so to say, is conducted to get at that point, that plane of immanence, you may say, where there is qualitative difference. But at the same time, all these qualitative differences are seen as from a single viewpoint. They all coexist in that sense. Below that, they are emergences. Each one is an emergence of something which is answering the limitations of the present. So can we find this kind of meeting point where temporality and atemporality coexist without really hazing each other or erasing each other? This is, I think, the question that he's raising in something like Savitri. So you have to understand this notion of the vertical and the horizontal in that sense. It's there throughout his work. Even when we are talking about cultures and the ideal of human unity, there is the notion of time. The thesis of the ideal of human unity is that we start with a sense of the I and the other, or the we and the other, that over time becomes much more universalized. That is the ideal of human unity. We've arrived today, we have cultural histories that are isolated. Each one, they're porous, as Lakshmi ji was saying, they're porous, but at the same time, they also have very distinct, boundaries and differences. But they come to a certain point in time where we find this kind of coexistence where they have to account for each other. They're no longer capable of, the luxury of an independent existence. I think one of the things I was reflecting when I was listening to Lakshmi ji is the whole issue of the Russian thinkers. That these Russian thinkers and the ones that she's talking about, they're all talking about this dialogicity, the dialogic imagination. And on the other hand, they're in Stalinist Russia, which is really trying to create a uniform world. We are up against the same thing today. And in a sense, their work in that sense is a work of resistance. It's a covert resistance against that mindset that they are trying to, expose to the world. And I think that's what Sri Aurobindo is also saying, that we've moved to a point where now we are coexisting, and we have to find a point where the one and the many are in relation, are together, without erasing each other.
Just to sort of, I was doing research on Abhinav Gupta and, at the Banaras Hindu University, and Kamlesh Datta Tripathi, he had read quite a bit of Bakhtin, and we had considerable exchanges. So in a very jovial way, he said, Bakhtin must have been an old Indian soul reborn in Russia somewhere, because I take the position that long before, now in the Western world, multiplicity, all this, but a much deeper philosophical level that has always been the part and parcel of Indian intellectual traditions, just by the mere composition. And I think unless we really recover the philosophy of dialogicality, all the diversity of India, and secondly, the issue of, the issue of, I'm sorry about this, multiplicity is not who's a Bengali and who's a Gujarati. Multiplicity is really about diversity of ideas, diversity of genres. Everyone can be just simply the same way, and that's not diversity. And that is what is happening in much of the world today. Everything has been reduced to tokenism. Okay, let me bring in an Indian, plug them into this. That is where the real, so we have not sorted out, we are just simply using, meanings have become detached from the words. Oh, multiplicity. What is multiplicity? We have to talk about the diversity of ideas, the diversity of genres. And when we become intolerant towards that, today in America, the cancel culture and everything is unbearable. In my view, because one is sort of really becoming afraid, and I'm saying that it is even worse than what it was for the Stalinist, these thinkers. At least they managed to write in, obliquely, and managed to keep their souls intact, kind of. But this one is really, unbearable. In today's times, I think, because we are not really living the diversity. We are only just simply using words mindlessly, So anyway.
So, Madam, answer, and Professor Shubham Dutta.
Yeah.
I want to recite just a short stanza from
Sure.
Savitri.
Yes.
And with a request to both of you, Professor Banerji and Lakshmi Mudiji and Shubham Dutta, Madam, with another session, we will just fix.
Yeah.
It is from The Word of Fate, Canto 1, Book 6, The Book of Fate. Repeat, ma'am?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, ma'am. Below him, circling born the myriad suns, he bore the ripples of the etheric sea. A primal year brought the first joy of touch. A secret spirit drew its mighty breath, contracting and expanding this huge world in its formidable circuit through the void. The secret might of the creative fire, played its triple power to build and form, its infinitesimal web sparks weaving dance, its nebulous units grounding shape and mass, magic foundation and pattern of the world, its radiance bursting into the light of stars. He felt a sap of life, a sap of death into solid matter's dense communion, plunging and its obscure oneness of forms he shared with the down spirit identity.
Very nice.
Actually, Madam, is Sri Aurobindo or Sir speaking about the pre-creation, the time of pre-creation or proto-atomic theory? Though
I have to think. I cannot just give an immediate answer to that. Besides, I could not even find the page. So I was struggling as you were.
415, madam.
450. Well, it depends on which edition. So it's not everybody.
Oh, actually, yes, madam.
Yeah.
My edition is different, madam. So
Yeah.
you can't find that.
Yeah. So
Sir,
I think we need to have another session. For you, it is getting a little late. And I think my tummy is growling. I haven't had my lunch. So we will definitely, because I think art and answerability and Sri Aurobindo, that intersection is really very productive. And it would be great for us to, have other sessions. So that will be, next time a little earlier will be better. I know for Professor Banerji, California time. So to coordinating Indian, Bangladeshi in New York, not an easy task. But I'll definitely, at least when you send me I'll think about it, because I can't think of this. Sri Aurobindo is a giant. You cannot just like that pull it out of your mind and speak. You have to give it a lot of thinking. I'll definitely think through and send it. Yeah.
Now I would like to I would like to request Professor Shubham Dutta to conclude and end the session.
Thank you everyone present. It's 1:45 as per Indian Standard Time. Here it's almost midnight. Still, the session is on, and we are quite enthusiastically participating in the Q&A session, and that proves the popularity of Sri Aurobindo and how relevant Sri Aurobindo even at times. So with this, I would like to thank all of you. I would like to thank Professor Lakshmi Bandlamudi ma'am, Professor Debashish Banerji, Gazi, Nishad, and last but not the least, Kanchan for organizing such a wonderful session. I hope we are going to have such sessions again in the future. Thank you all. Good night for the Indians, and
good afternoon.
Thank you.
Meeting you. Yeah.
Thank you. Very, very nice meeting you all, and very stimulating session.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thanks.